Our featured speaker is Sarah, Discovering the Ancient Sky, the Archaeology of Astronomy. So at this point, I will stop sharing and give Sarah the screen that I am so looking forward to seeing her presentation.
Okay.
Very good.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark and Joe, for inviting me to do this. My lecture will be a little bit more formal than I'm used to and less image rich due both to time and copyright constraints. I know you're recording this, and that's fine, but that means I can't show you the gazillion images that I usually use. Okay, now it's not advancing. There we go. A junior year abroad in Israel changed my life forever. I got by Middle Eastern archaeology and ancient languages. Although I studied Egypt and Mesopotamia, the course was actually called Egg and Mess. I did do astronomical knowledge of these cultures a little bit later, actually much later. It's only near the end of my university career that I learned about the site of Cahokia, Illinois, the biggest city north of Mexico at about 1000 AD, which has some of the most intriguing astronomical alignments anywhere. I hope to show them to you if the technology continues to work. All right, let's go this way. Archaeology is the study of the physical remains of ancient human cultures, houses, temples, tombs, and artifacts, and their interpretation. I have to say this because if I say I've been on an archaeological dig, everybody still asks me if I dig, what kind of dinosaurs did I find? Archaeology as a discipline has gotten increasingly interdisciplinary. We use chemistry, physics, geology, and medicine, and looking at things like the organic residues inside pots to find out what they contained, ceramic technology, which was one of my specialties, where we're trying to find out where the clay came from and then how the finished product is traded. Mummies, a special love of mine because we had exactly one Egyptian mummy at the University of Illinois, and now astronomy. I also like to say that archaeology is like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. There are so many times when we have questions that can't be answered because we don't have the context. Archaeoastronomy is not a new subdiscipline. It's been going on for a while, but as the University of Maryland developed a Center for Archaeoastronomy, and they define it as the study of astronomical practices, celestial lore, mythologies, religions, and worldviews of all ancient cultures. In other words, the anthropology of astronomy rather than the history of astronomy. So we're talking about people and not the invention of various types of telescopes and other instruments for measuring celestial bodies. Last fall, I began preparing a 4-week class with the same title as this lecture, Discovering the Ancient Sky, for our local Lifelong Learning Center. Naturally, I began my preparation with several books I already owned going back to the 80s and 90s, but they were somewhat out of date. In this book, I found everything I needed to get me started. And this book is on Amazon, and I don't remember that it was particularly expensive. The author, Ken Taylor, started as a landscape architect, but he is obviously boned up on both astronomy and archaeology. This is a coffee table book. I mean, it's got stunning photographs. I would highly recommend acquiring it. What I'm doing today is only the tip of the iceberg, and he has a lot of other stuff that I would like to explore. One of the things I think you'll find most interesting is that instead of organizing the book by chronology and geography, the way an archaeologist would usually see things, his book is organized by celestial events. So he starts with solar alignments, then lunar, then wandering planets, then other things, eclipses, and he ends up with a section on cosmic cities and landscapes, which is just stunning. So I quickly realized that what fascinates me the most is trying to make sense of the earliest material from cultures who had no written language or modern instrumentation. Oh, come back, little control. Imagine that you live in a world without electric light or modern instruments, so that the night sky is a huge part of your life. That the only moving celestial bodies you can see are the sun, the moon, and the 5 closest planets. That you believe all these bodies move around the earth, that the earth is the center, and that these celestial bodies are associated with multiple gods who influence and control human events. I had to insert this. I found this quote again today, and it's one of my absolute favorites from the old series, I, Claudius. Why have people always gazed at and worshiped the night sky? To understand the place of human beings in the universe, to appease the gods or God, to predict the future and plan when to plant and when to harvest, and to connect with people who have died. Studying events such as solstices, equinoxes, phases of the moon, and eclipses help us make sense of things and to create a calendar against which we can calibrate everything else. But as Ken Taylor, the author of the book I just showed you, as he says, if you look for astronomical alignments, you will find them. So it pays to be very careful how you interpret them. The subject is vast and extremely hard to condense into one lecture. I'm going to give a few examples of possible celestial markings on individual artifacts and cave paintings, discuss what context means to archaeologists, and then give a few examples of sites with clear solar and lunar alignments from around the world. Think of this as a smorgasbord. You're getting just a little taste of several things. We'll also visit 2 cultures that believe the planet Venus was particularly important, the Babylonians and the Maya. Early Middle Eastern cultures, such as the Babylonians and the Egyptians, used their observations of the sky to predict human events. In other words, to practice astrology rather than the science astronomy that we know today. Such cultures were ruled by kings who pretty much saw themselves as gods, so maintaining power was key. Just think, if the king or his chief priest can predict a solar eclipse, that gives him a big advantage over uninformed citizens. He can simply say, you better pay your taxes immediately or I'll just make the sun go away. Beginning about 1800 BC, the Babylonians and their successors in Mesopotamia used detailed observations and sophisticated arithmetic to develop a calendar based on the motions of the sun, the precise time of the new moon, and the mysterious movements of planets like Venus. They recorded their observations on thousands of clay tablets, like this one. They did not, however, understand the Earth's true position in the solar system. It took the Greeks to figure out that the sun, not the Earth, was the center around which the Earth and the other planets rotate. Before we take a look at specific archaeological sites with celestial alignments, I want to show you a few isolated objects that have been divorced from their original find spots. This one is called the Ishango bone. It is the slightly curved fibula of a baboon. It dates to the Paleolithic period. That's about 23,000 to 14,000 BC, and it was found in the Congo. Multiple incisions occur on more than one side. I think it's 3 sides, but I can't remember because I don't have that slide. So what is this? Is it a tally stick, a lunar calendar, or something else? Well, as you might imagine, lots of people over time have weighed in on this, including 2 mathematicians. Numbers in 2 of the columns add up to 60, corresponding perhaps with 2 lunar months. This is the mathematician Alexander Marshak. But his colleague, Claudia Zaslewski, says, well, it could be a woman tracking lunar phases in relation to her menstrual cycle. You choose. This is a time period where we have no language and no labels attached to the objects we find. So speculation is wide open. Here's another one. I was able to visit the French and Spanish Paleolithic caves a few years ago, which just blew my mind. And so I read a lot of the literature on what the Paleolithic cave paintings might mean. The painted cave of Lascaux, dated to 19,000 to 17,000 BC, has been interpreted in various ways. It might be a primer for hunters, what you might find out in the landscape, a record of shamanistic visions, a recording of a zodiac, not necessarily the one we know today, or some kind of calendar. Scholars say many of the animals represent a seasonal calendar because so many of them are shown either mating or pregnant, about to give birth to different kinds of foals. But there are also several kinds of dots that you see in the different caves that could be constellations. The one I have a marker here to was 6 dots. Well, maybe that's the Hyades. Maybe, but I can't prove it. Neither can anybody else. Another set of dots in a different part of the same cave has been discussed. Okay, maybe this is the 13 and 26 week intervals between the summer solstice to the autumn equinox and then to the spring equinox. But that's only if you count each spot as 7 days. So you can play all kinds of mathematical games here. And again, we don't know. But wait a minute. Other people who've looked at the dots in strange places in these caves say they could signify other things. For example, some parts of the backs of these caves are dangerous. What if a row of dots means, don't crawl any further down this passage, there's a bottomless pit coming up? Problem, the context is missing, and there is no writing from this period to help interpret the paintings. Now, I threw this in. You'll understand in a moment why I did it. I bet you guys have all done this too. When I started researching archaeoastronomy, I paid a lot more attention to our own house, the cardinal directions where the sun rises and sets. I remembered the ice on the driveway on the north side of the house in winter. No surprise, since the sunrise and sunset occur further to the south at that time of year, and there's no heat and light on the north side of the driveway. Instead, our bedroom gets the sunlight pouring in. Well, many early people marked their horizons with piles of stones or other kinds of markers to help them keep track of the sun. So when you look at something like this is the Nebra sky disk. It's another isolated object made out of bronze and gold. It dates to somewhere between 1600 and 1000 BC. It was found in Germany by looters. So looters are not very good at recording where they got things. The interpretation, you look at this and you say, certainly there are shapes that resemble the sun and the moon. The edge of the disk could mark, the circle of the horizon as seen from the site, just like the crude diagram you saw of our property. There are gold solstice bands. I hope you can see the one on the right-hand side, which is obscured by my gallery view. So this could be, and then the other one is missing. So these bands could mark the positions of sunrise and sunset over the course of a year. Then I hope you can see my cursor, these 7 dots up here. Several people looked at it and said, aha, that's the Pleiades. Well, maybe so. But then my husband, who always likes to see the other side of things, says, what if it's just a smiley face with chicken pox and a squint? And I don't have an answer. So in archaeology, context is more than physical position in the ground. It is whole assemblages of artifacts and grave types and architecture and inscriptions that define a culture, a group of people in a particular time and place. Looking at the big picture also makes it possible to interpret nearby sites that have similar characteristics. Similarly, when we're talking about archaeoastronomy, when you're considering what astronomical alignments meant to ancient people, you need to look not just at a single building or a single artifact, but entire sites or assemblages in the context of larger landscapes and belief systems. So a little bit on the ancient Near East, because that was my starting point. In ancient Egypt, the cardinal directions were very important, as in other societies. But especially in Egypt, they affected how buildings, especially temples, were oriented. Egypt is in a desert climate, so a reliable source of water is paramount. The axis of the Nile River is north-south, and the annual flooding of the Nile determines how well crops produce and whether people starve or thrive. To the east, sunset, and that means rebirth to the Egyptians. To the west is sunset, death, and the country of the afterlife. Like Babylonians, the Egyptians were a hierarchical society where astrologers were members of the elite working for a supreme ruler who often was revered as a god. The Egyptians used a solar calendar of 365 days, 12 months with 30 days each, with 5 days tacked onto the end of the year. This is the calendar that Julius Caesar, Emperor of Rome, adopted in 46 BC. The Egyptians get the credit for the division of a day into 24 hours, measured by observations of 36 particular stars called decans. They use the heliacal risings to subdivide the calendar into 10-day periods. Sirius was a very special star, not just because it's the brightest star in the sky, but because its heliacal rising, its first appearance at dawn, just before the sun rises, is close to the summer solstice. And this means that the flooding of the Nile is coming. This is the period of peak fertility, and thus it was celebrated as the Egyptian New Year. This is the temple of Amun at Karnak that has typical solar alignments, the midwinter solstice to the east and the midsummer sunset to the west. And here you see a plan. A Victorian physicist named Norman Lockyer found these alignments relatively early, but they were disputed until the 1960s when Gerald Hawkins confirmed them. And I'm sure you remember Gerald Hawkins as the one who wrote Stonehenge Decoded, which was sort of the beginning for me of my interest in the ancient sky. And is still a fascinating book, but it's a good example of something that is much disputed and maybe possibly out of date in some respects. I note here that while the summer solstice may be celebrated for the height of the growing season, of fertility, of abundance, then in northern locations like central Illinois, or dare I say New Hampshire, the return of the light at the winter solstice might be even more important for people's well-being. And that's certainly true of me. So here's a wonderful site in Ireland called Newgrange, which is a great example. It's a chambered tomb mound erected at about 3300 BC. Sunlight comes into the tomb at the sunrise winter solstice and illuminates the burial chamber. The sun is framed by a specially built slot window. The sun shines on the ashes of the dead for a time, signifying rebirth and resurrection. Below this, you see a typical sun spiral carving. And this is really interesting because it appears in multiple cultures across the world, including North America and the Southwest, where I just visited. Ken Taylor, the author of Celestial Geometry, suggests that the spiral pattern is a result of people believing that the sun went underground or below the earth when it disappeared every day. So it would start by going from east to west around and then maybe go down under or behind and come back up. So we see this motif over and over again. Well, I can't really do this without mentioning Stonehenge. But Stonehenge is one of the most studied and measured monuments in the world. And I would suggest you look at Ken Taylor's work so you can see just how much more there is out there. I won't spend too much time on it because there's so much information on the web that's easily accessible and a gazillion books. The most important thing to say is that this is a site with a deep history of thousands of years of use, multiple construction phases, and multiple functions. Stonehenge began as a burial and ceremonial center with no architecture at all. It's only in the latest phases that two types of stone were used to create several stone circles and a horseshoe of massive trilithons. That's what we see in every photograph of Stonehenge. The two types of stone are blue stones from a quarry in Wales and huge sandstone blocks to make the really massive three-piece things that were imported from about 18 miles away from Stonehenge. The people who did this must have had compelling reasons because of the labor, the sheer labor and the time involved in doing this. The labor was huge, requiring many people and animals, and as people have experimented and speculated, various devices such as ropes, sledges, animals, and if they did part of the passage over water, rafts to accomplish. This site has clear solar and lunar alignments for the later phases. But the interesting thing is these alignments are echoed at other British sites with round henges that have even more precise alignments. So if you look at these all together, you have kind of a sacred landscape. There was an article you might have seen recently. It was in February of this year in the New York Times. They have a quote. They say, as archaeologist and writer Jacquetta Hawkes said in 1967, every age has the Stonehenge it deserves or desires. Over time, the interpretations of this site have changed. Go from sacred ceremonial site to observatory, or maybe you think it's an alien construction, to modern solar worship tourist trap. Perhaps the best way to view Stonehenge is a kind of outdoor church. And as an early archaeologist, Aubrey Burrell said, a monument in which the sun, the moon, and the dead were joined together, and that maybe we shouldn't try to separate any of those things. Now we're going to jump across the world and take a short tour to South America. Machu Picchu was not just an observatory, but a royal estate, a religious center, and a burial place built by the Inca about 1450 AD. So this is the latest site we're looking at tonight. It has several alignments, particularly with solar events, but also lunar. At the solstices, the priests metaphorically tied down the sun at a particular place, at this stone, which they called the Intihuatana, or the hitching post of the sun. The explanation is that on the summer solstice, and you have to remember we're in South America, so this is December instead of June, the sun appears to set behind a sacred mountain that is called Pumachillo, the puma's claw. Same site, in a nearby royal mausoleum, there is a natural cave with carvings indicating a high status burial or several burials. And the entrance is aligned to face the sun on the winter or June solstice in this location. Machu Picchu was clearly an important multi-purpose site, not just an observatory. We shouldn't overemphasize the alignments, the astronomical alignments, to the point that we forget its other functions. That would be archaeological cherry picking, which is exactly what I'm doing in this lecture, choosing my favorite things to show to you. Here's another Peruvian site. I didn't know about this one at all. Chanquillo, Peru is a solar observatory built in the 4th century BC, long before the Incas came on the scene. Remember that diagram of our property with little X's? Well, these people built 13 towers of rock with stairs aligned north-south to act as solar markers, to record where the sun rose and set. They also had a central fortified complex that includes a temple, an administrative building, a plaza, and 2 distinct east-west observation points so they could correlate all these sightings. They really knew what they were doing. Clive Ruggles, a British astronomer and archaeoastronomer of the International Council of Museums, says, the Chanquillo Solar Observation Device is a masterful example of landscape timekeeping, a practice of ancient civilizations worldwide that use visible natural or cultural features. At Chanquillo, we find direct indications of all 4 solstitial rising and setting points, together with the means to observe and uniquely identify the time of year with a precision of 2 to 3 days by observing sunrises or sunsets against the towers. So now for a little digression before I go back to more solar and lunar alignments, I want to talk about Venus. I was absolutely fascinated by all the Venus stuff. It's really interesting that 2 diverse cultures, the Babylonians and the Maya, on opposite sides of the world at widely different time periods, place so much emphasis on Venus. Why? Well, you guys probably know because you know a lot more astronomy than I do. Venus wanders in a characteristic pattern that some people have called a pentagram or a rose when viewed from Earth. Its movements are orderly if you're looking from out in space, but very confusing to people on Earth because the planet periodically disappears for days or months and then reappears in the sky in a different place and different time. That's why we know Venus as both a morning star and an evening star. So I looked at this. I said, well, it makes sense to me. If you can't explain it, You make it into a goddess, as they did in Mesopotamia, or a god, as the Maya did. Here's this tablet that I showed you earlier. This is one of the most famous of all Mesopotamian tablets, the Venus tablet, and it's a 7th century copy of a much older tablet. And it records the heliacal risings and settings of Venus over a period of 21 years. That's amazing. A similar text gives an example of how the Babylonian observations are tied to human events. If the Queen of Heaven disappears on the 25th day of the 4th month for 2 months and 4 days, and then reappears on the 29th day of month 11, the harvest will be successful. So here's a little bit of astrology in action. And I'm not entirely sure this quote is completely accurate because of my terrible handwriting. Now we will jump across the world to the Maya. I was introduced to the Maya early on when I was studying their earlier inhabitants of the Yucatan Peninsula. I thought, boy, these people take the world really seriously, and the Maya in particular have a rather grim worldview. They were obsessed with tracking the exact movements of the sun and moon and certain planets because they believed their gods controlled everything that happened to them, especially agricultural cycles, fertility versus famine, planting and harvesting, when the sun comes, when the rain comes. The cycles of the moon and Venus were particularly important, and the Maya explain the detailed eclipse and Venus orbital cycles, and they detail everything in lime-coated bark almanacs or codices. And this is the world-famous Dresden Codex with lunar eclipse and flood diagrams and Venus tablets. So the Maya associated the 8-day period between Venus's disappearance as the evening star and its reappearance as the morning star with the death and resurrection of a male deity known as Kukulkan. This is a site that has Venus alignments along with a lot of other stuff. This is the governor's palace in the Yucatan. And it's an example of a building within a site that has a special alignment compared to the other buildings because it's aligned with Venus. So you see here a plan of the whole site, and you can see the axes of most of the buildings are going one direction. And here's this one that's skewed off to the right. That's the governor's palace. A Mayan standing at the central entrance on this side, where the gray rectangle is, at about AD 900, would have looked across the top of a pyramid 3 miles away to a spot on the horizon where Venus rose as the morning star at its southernmost declination. And Venus appears over and over again in their architecture and their codices. And when I started looking at Mayan glyphs, this would take years of study to get the hang of. I did a crude sketch of one here to show you that the rain god Chak is symbolized by these symbols here, and here's the Venus symbol right below it. But that's not the only Venus symbol. It changes, it morphs. It comes back in many forms. So that's another rabbit hole I could go down if I wanted to. Now we leap to North America. In North America, we have several sites with spectacular alignments. Chaco Canyon, a remote site in the New Mexico desert. My husband and I were near there recently, but we wimped out on visiting this particular place after hearing friends' description of over 20 miles of severe washboard roads, which resulted in a $2,000 bill to replace their car's suspension struts. So since we had a rental car at the time, I said, well, I know the key site is closed, and I've seen the rest of it from pictures, so Chaco Canyon's not going to happen on this particular trip. What you see here is Pueblo Bonito, a large group of houses, and round kiwas, which were special ceremonial rooms for men only. But the cool thing is that the whole complex is oriented east-west along the axis of the spring and fall equinoxes. Also, part of Chaco Canyon is this other place called Fajada Butte. There are slabs of rock carved with petroglyphs that are positioned so the sunlight makes patterns, and on the morning of the summer solstice, sunlight appears in the big sun spiral petroglyph and lengthens until it forms a long, narrow shape, the so-called sun dagger. On the equinoxes, a thin shaft of light shines on the sun spiral off-center, and a second, shorter shaft splits the coil of the smaller petroglyph, which is interpreted as a snake. Unfortunately, in about 1989, people noticed the sandstone slabs had shifted. So the phenomenon everybody was so excited about was no longer observable. The area was reinforced with a retaining wall so the slabs won't slip any further, and the site closed to the public. To help make up for missing Chaco Canyon, as we sailed through Arizona, we stopped at the Painted Desert National Monument and found a new place I'd never seen called Puerto Pueblo that has similar sun markers with sun daggers. But of course, we were not there on a solstice or equinox, but could not see the phenomenon. And finally, I'm getting close to the end here, finishing up with a site close to home. This is the vast site of Cahokia near St. Louis. It's only about 2.5 hours drive from my house. At its peak, this ceremonial center had over 20,000 people, more than that if you count the smaller settlements that grew up around it. Like the other sites we've looked at, it was a multi-purpose city created by a highly organized group of elites who clearly understood the importance of both cardinal directions and astronomical alignments. Studies of the human remains at Cahokia show that a multi-ethnic population gathered at Cahokia several times a year for worship, burials, and other rituals. So what you see here is Mock's Mound. This is the biggest mound. It was a gazillion barrels of dirt to make this, so another example of massive labor and organization required. And here is a layout that shows, again, this is Mock's Mound. There is a causeway going south towards a burial mound here, and then continuing south, and then the east-west axis. Here is a wood henge, like the one at Stonehenge and other places in the world, that has positions. It has post holes that originally held wooden poles marking solstices and equinoxes. Cahokia's sudden growth between, it's just a 100-year period, 1050 to 1150 AD, used to be attributed to its position on the Mississippi River, meaning it was ideal for trade north, south, east, west. Now scholars believe Cahokia's expansion was due to the rise of a state religion at the same time as widespread adoption of maize agriculture, which made it possible for the first time to support a really large population. The construction, organized construction at Cahokia and related sites involved not only the temple and burial mounds of Cahokia, but several other places with the same orientations. So what are these orientations? This is a crude diagram based on the work of William Romaine, who did some mathematics and other things, but what he is showing here is similar key points that are actually some of the same ones we saw at Stonehenge and other locations But this particular rectangle that shows the main axis of Cahokia is 5 degrees off north. And so there are other alignments, but these are the key alignments. So you have a lunar axis and a solar axis. And that seems to be what is common across the world. Both these things are important. The architecture is closely connected with the cosmology of the early inhabitants of this area. The Mississippians, that's what they call the people who lived between about 100 and 1100 AD, believed in a watery underworld, a flat middle world where people live, and an upper realm, all connected by a central axis. The upper realm is the home of most gods and the afterlife. In order to reach the afterlife, the soul of a dead person has to reach the Milky Way, or path of souls. He or she had to pass through a portal located in the area of the 3 stars of Orion's belt during a narrow window of time. When Cahokia was built, the surrounding land was quite swampy, so mounds were built upwards to raise up key monuments. From the top of Monk's Mound, the largest temple mound, a person could stand facing the southern causeway that led to the burial mounds further south. So the idea is the dead moved to the south. On the days of the solstices, the Milky Way appeared to be almost vertical, with one end close to the ground. That means the solstices were the narrow window of time, the best time to hop into the sky. In later Sioux culture, the image of the lower half of Orion with the portal morphs into a well-known hand-eye motif that appears on pottery, on engraved shells, and so many other places. And, well, I'll say this in a minute. I hope you've enjoyed this brief look at archaeoastronomy and individual artifacts, tombs, and ceremonial sites. Finding celestial alignments is a lot of fun, but proving their significance is difficult without a larger context. It's easier to interpret our findings through the lens of our own time and place rather than to project ourselves into the past. I mentioned one of my favorite sources, but I wanted to show you a couple of others. These are the 2 books I started with, which go back at least 20 years. I can't remember the dates now, but Evan Haddingham turns out to be another archaeologist, and his book, Early Man and the Cosmos, I think is still available as a used book. The other one I used, The First Stargazers, by James Cornell, who is a science writer who did a really great job. And what happened to my other slide here? Okay, it moved around. Okay, so Anthony Avini has written, good heavens, 8 to 10 books about archaeoastronomy. So if you haven't come across them, you should take a look. Most of these books are available on Amazon, and it turns out he took Evan Haddingham to the Yucatan. And so they worked together on all these Mayan sites. So if you want the really deep stuff on the Mayan civilization, this is the place to go. I wanted to say that my blog, which is an active and public site, has many links and the bibliography that I put together for the 4-week class, including many of the sources I drew on tonight. And hopefully I'll remember in the next couple of days to add a couple more. And then the last thing I wanted to point out, do you all know about the sun wheel at the University of Massachusetts? This is the invention of astronomer Judith Young, who set up a Stonehenge-like circle for teaching solar and lunar environments. And it's a wonderful website. And one of the best things I found is in her section, Moon Teaching for the Masses. Numerous diagrams that help me understand all these alignments as a non-astronomer, and just great teaching stuff. So I'll stop there and try to answer any questions you might have.
Sarah, that was wonderful. And I thank you very much for a very engaging presentation. And I'm sure we'll get some good questions. Go.
Oh, there are a lot more people here.
Bethany.
I don't have any questions, but I wanted to compliment you. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's amazing how hard it was to cut down from 4 lectures at 90 minutes each and to pick and choose.
Yes.
So, I was familiar with a number of the sites and
Oh, you
artifacts,
want me to, yeah.
again, thank you very much.
I
But
have
there's
it
a
all
lot of
pulled up
new
on my
ones.
computer.
Okay, can you forget?
Which page? Yeah.
No, we pay.
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you very, very much. A number of them I was familiar with, and number of some of the artifacts and things like that that you showed, like the one that the looters had found and so forth. There's a good article on that not too long ago.
Mhm.
I can't remember where.
Sky and Telescope might have been.
That's what it was. Yep.
Use
Yep.
it, yeah.
Yep. So, but a lot of new ones that are new old ones that I hadn't heard of. So did you cut it way down from to select a few, did you? I mean, to get it down to 4?
I could not have, well, I could have cut it further, but I don't think it would have been any fun. Since my message is that context matters. So when you look at these things, you really need to look at the whole culture around a particular site. And if you just turn it into a traveling tour, you would miss a lot of material. One of the things that I cut out that I kind of wish I didn't was Angkor Wat in Cambodia, which is in Ken Taylor's book, Celestial Astronomy, and details just incredible planning for both solar alignments and lunar alignments. And then there's a mountain in the middle, an artificial mountain with a super steep stairway. I think it's about 80 degrees. So if you're crawling up that to emphasize how hard it is to reach the realm of the gods. So, sun, moon, God, religion, all this stuff tightly tied together. And that makes me think of, the ziggurats of Ur and the idea of the Tower of Babel, too, that people have always tried to find a way to connect with the sky.
Any other questions for Sarah?
So there are a number of links, like to your blog and so forth. They were all at the
Yes.
end. It would be nice if those got sent to the list.
I can do that. I've got it. I have a file. I also have, but that's why I put the blog site up there, because there are a few pictures there. There's also some material from a course that I taught that involved Cahokia that has, I had video links up there too. So there are a bunch of great video links, both for astronomical things and tours of sites, particularly the Yucatan ones, Cahokia, all that stuff about the path of souls and the portal in Orion. There was a PBS special on cosmic cities. And my colleague, Tim Pacatot, who's one of the world experts on Cahokia, appears in that. And I drew heavily on his material.
Yeah, make sure you include your blog site as well.
Yep, it's well, this is recorded, so.
Right. You have to go to the end.
Send me the
definitely
links,
send-
Sarah, and when I send a link to the YouTube video, I will include your links also.
Okay, I'd be pleased to do that. Give me a couple days.
Other questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Ludwig,
Yes.
easily, yep.
Loud and clear.
Okay. Van Daniken, yes?
Oh, yes.
And he goes way back and has a lot of mysterious issues he's pointing out. And do you find anything where you sorry about that, find something, maybe a missing link? Perhaps more ancient people had knowledge, were aware, which kind of faded away and it's kind of reappeared. Like you kind of mentioned that certain symbols reappeared on certain.
Well, I'll try to answer that. I had von Daniken's book in my first lecture for the OLLI class. I said what I'm doing. You're
Must have lost the connection.
Yes. Okay, did you finish your question there?
Well, yeah, just to recap, it seems like there was much more advanced knowledge at one time, maybe a million years ago, and it was lost, and we're rediscovering it now. Do you find a kind of a missing gap in our?
No, I don't think there's a gap. I think ancient people have always been smarter than we give them credit for, and that even those Paleolithic painters of the caves, because they were in touch with the cycles of nature and the sky, and they observed things every single day, they knew as much or more than we do. They just expressed it in different ways. And they didn't record things in a way that we can understand them. So certainly when I look at their work and then the massive files of the Maya and the Babylonians, I mean, just their stick-to-itiveness, making all those observations and writing them down and finding, just using pattern recognition after just naked eye astronomy, it's pretty astounding what they did, and they laid the basis for modern astronomy. And so then when you get to the Greeks, and the Greeks are better at asking questions, do we have the right model of the solar system? What if the Earth isn't at the center? And I did not include things like the Antikythera machine, which was in there before, but there was a Scientific American article quite recently on that. And you can't read that article without thinking, boy, they really knew their stuff. And we still have a lot to learn from them. And it's interesting that they've known about that particular mechanism for many years, but it wasn't till we got the very advanced kind of three-dimensional CAT scans that we used on our one and only Egyptian mummy that they're able to decipher what was always there. That there's a primer for how to use it. There's correlation between solar and lunar calendars. There's just all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's jaw-dropping.
Sarah, that was a really good perspective on things, and I like that perspective and that approach. They were smart, and certainly in a different way, and it's up to us to understand that.
Well, for one thing, they were paying more attention to the sky and things than we do in modern days.
Exactly. I mean,
regarding von Daniken, you have to keep in mind that his book is essentially recycled Nazi propaganda from the Ahnenerbe SS.
Okay. I confess that I never read the whole thing. I looked at it, and as an anthropology student, I said, wait a minute, this is, the premise to me was saying that humans aren't advanced enough to invent all this stuff. It has to be alien construction, and I just thought that premise was dead wrong.
Yeah, there's one of our members actually had a debate with von Daniken when he was doing his. That was why am I losing his name? He also was involved in archaeology down in the Yucatan.
Okay.
But anyway, von Daniken gave his presentation first, and then our man stepped up.
Well, I would have liked to be a fly on the wall for that.
All right. Any other questions for Sarah?
Okay, well, look for my blog. I will send a list of links and videos to you guys so you can explore on your own. The blog also has the full bibliography that I use for my course, so you can explore that, and quite a bit is available on Amazon. And again, I mentioned Anthony Avini, who started as an astronomer and then veered into archaeology. So someone who has the science background and then tackles another field, his perspective is really valuable.
Very good. Sarah, thank you very much. I enjoyed this immensely. Well worth it.
Okay, I will leave you to your business meeting, and I may go get a snack now.
Okay, thank you, Sarah.
Okay, bye-bye.